At the end of our last video, looking at the Tandem 286 motherboard that we unfortunately didn't get into a working state, I teased the contents of a box I'd received. And that contents represents potentially the holy grail in my search for my old 286 machine, an IBM 5170. But this machine is quite possibly in the worst condition imaginable. Well, here we have the box that I teased on the last video. You can see underneath this layer of bubble wrap there's already signs of rust. Well, let's tear all this bubble wrap off and see if we've got something that we can service underneath. I apologise, this was too big to fit on my bench, so I've had to resort to using the chair. Not an ideal thing to unpack a quite unwieldy 1980s PC on, but nevertheless it'll have to do. As we peel back the layers of bubble wrap, the rust becomes more and more evident. Well, that's definitely some surface rust. The front fascia of the case looks in reasonable condition. The corners are a little bit chewed. Looking at the back, as we peel this wrap off, you can see that the rust goes right to that far edge. This doesn't particularly scare me, having worked with cars and respraying, and I've often felt that the designers of the 5170, from a case perspective certainly, probably went on to work for Volvo, given the mass of over-engineering that this case represents. On the back of the case there's more rust, and these screws are going to be quite difficult to get out. It looks like the majority of the insides of the power supply have let go, and even if we have to put a modern power supply inside this, and it's definitely got a motherboard in the case, and there's some cards showing in the slots, but the only way we're going to find out what those are is by opening this machine up. The screws at the top of the case aren't too bad, but looking at the bottom I start to worry whether this is in a worse state than the Tandem we've just worked on. The screws on the bottom are incredibly tight and corroded. As you can see, this is actually starting to bend my little screwdriver, so probably before the end of this we're going to have to find a different solution for the screwdriver. Oh, and I've missed the screw in the center, so let's take that out. As we pull back the case, it reveals, well, on the face of it, not too bad. So we've definitely got an original IBM motherboard in here, a 286 processor. We've got an MFM hard drive. Likelihood of the MFM drive working, not so much. The floppy drive, potentially. It's a half height 5 1/4 floppy drive. And it looks like somebody's had this out previously, as some of the connectors are sort of half in. And that's kind of thing that wouldn't tend to happen during transit. So this is the memory card, 128K. We've got a hard drive and floppy drive controller. And we've got some sort of video card. And alongside that, there's also a standard sort of parallel serial port card. First card I've taken out is graphics, and well, we'll have to look it up, but it's either EGA or CGA. Next to be removed is the standard parallel serial port interface. Nothing particularly special. Next we've got the 128k RAM expansion card. This would bring the machine to a total of 640k. Quite a respectable 286 machine for the day. Not sure about the corrosion on the back of this card. It doesn't appear to particularly marry up with anything that would actually rust. So I'm guessing this is probably something that's fallen on it or been deposited from the rest of the machine corroding. Could even be a row screw that's just disappeared. So just removing the floppy drive and hard drive cables, so we can actually remove the floppy drive and hard drive controller. And this is a standard IBM piece, which I believe was probably produced by Western Digital. They tend to be relatively reliable cards, so hopefully that will probably still work. And down in the bottom of here we have a somewhat destructed battery, and this might well have been the cause of some of that corrosion, as it appears to have done some leaking. The rest of the corrosion appears to be mainly located around the power supply, which could well mean that the capacitors have in fact just leaked. A little bit resistant, but that's the hard drive and floppy card. Next we'll take out the restraining screws for the floppy drive and get that removed. Assuming I don't manage to lose them on the floor. Well, that's one reasonably working looking 5 1/4 drive. Definitely some surface rust on the stepper motor, but the bearings appear to be okay. Obviously we'll have to try that out later. Just so I know where they are, I'm going to put the screws back into the case. Unplugging all the power, because we don't really need that connected. We're going to take the motherboard out of this anyway. Well, at this point is to remove the power supply next. But the screws in this are pretty much rusted solid. So the two screws that are holding the power supply in on the bottom, I'm going to have to try something a little more powerful than my little screwdriver. Unfortunately, even this isn't capable of getting them out. The screws are just far too corroded, and they have barely any head to get any purchase to remove them. At this point, it makes more sense to remove the hard drive, and we'll tackle the power supply once we've got everything else out of the case. Just need to remove the MFM cables from the back of the hard drive. We can take those out. So one hard drive removed. Has a little bit of corrosion. Generally speaking, looks to be in reasonable shape. The old MFM hard drives do have a reputation for being quite unreliable. So now see if we can get the motherboard out. Motherboard just has 2 retaining screws, and then the rest is held in by little plastic things underneath. On non-IBM cases, those little plastic things were the bane of everybody's life. But I've often found on the old IBMs they were actually quite easy to remove. Hopefully that's the case here. Well, as I said, relatively easy. So the motherboard, though weirdly covered in rust, seems to be in reasonable condition. You can actually see chunks of rust kicking about on the surface of the board. Now this isn't corrosion from the board itself, that's what it's picked up from the power supply and the case, which you can see has suffered some quite considerable damage. And that power supply is, well, scary. Well, that's probably the worst power supply I have ever set eyes on. Something quite catastrophic has caused this corrosion. I would suspect potentially leaked capacitors, but really until I take it apart, I'm not quite sure. There's even bits of it still stuck to the inside of the case. Well, we'll continue this next time.